Today is Tuesday, July 11th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. If we look back at ancient Roman civilization, one of the symbols of the Roman world was the great Colosseum. And it's quite amazing for us to look back and see that great building, which was one of the wonders of the world, and to consider how much money, resources, skill, time, and attention were put into a building like the Colosseum. It's important for us to realize what a massive public undertaking that was. And when I say public, I mean governmental. What a massive project the Colosseum was. And when we consider the Colosseum as a project, we have to ask, what was the function of the Colosseum? And most of us are familiar, at least to some extent, of the purpose that was served by the Colosseum. It was a place where the Roman people gathered in large numbers to sit and watch all kinds of thrilling events. It was a spectator arena. When we think of sports arenas and concert halls, we often think of them focusing on the performers that are on the field or on the court or on the stage. And we often imagine that these arenas and theaters are about performances, about competition, and so on. But the truth is, these arenas, like the Colosseum, they don't exist for the sake of any competition. They don't exist for any performance. They exist for spectators. The Colosseum wasn't built for any athletic games or any gladiator contests. The Colosseum was built to hold thousands and thousands of spectators. That's what the Colosseum was for. That's what the arenas in our society are for. They're not for the performances. If you pay attention to what's going on in the media, you'll know that Taylor Swift is all over the place on tour, and she sells out arenas night after night after night. Huge arenas filled with tens of thousands of men, women, and children, with one skinny little girl on stage, usually with a guitar. That arena is not for Taylor Swift to sing and dance a little bit. Those arenas are built for the spectators. When we look at the arenas that are built in America, we see the price of the construction of these arenas is now over $1 billion. The first arena or stadium to go over $1 billion for the cost of its construction was I think it's AT&T Stadium in Dallas. It was the Dallas Cowboys Stadium. The owner, Jerry Jones, spent over $1 billion to build that stadium, and that's really become something of the norm. Another one was built in Los Angeles. You can look up some of these statistics, but the stadiums just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's not really accurate when I say Jerry Jones built the stadium, because even though he's the owner of the team, when we look into the details, we find that these are not simple private construction projects. These are not simple private business endeavors. These stadiums that are built are funded and supported by the government. And so, just like in ancient Rome, we see that the American government takes great interest in the construction of coliseums. And again, it's important for us to realize that the coliseums that are built, the stadiums and arenas that are built for hundreds of millions of dollars, even more than $1 billion, they're not built for the artists or for the athletes. They're built for spectators. Giant coliseums funded by the government to hold tens of thousands of spectators. Some of the biggest crowds at American events are found in college football stadiums. Some examples like Ohio State University, the University of Michigan, the University of Tennessee, Alabama, and so on, can have crowds with over 100,000 fans at a single event. And this is a college activity. And remember, these are colleges that are state universities. These are state-funded institutions. In fact, it's impossible today to distinguish a university from its athletic programs. If I were to ask you to name great universities that you can think of, you might name a few Ivy League schools like Harvard and Princeton and Yale. But as the list goes on, you'll start naming major universities, and the reason why most of us know their names, is not because of any academic achievement of these institutions, but because of their sports teams. And we have to stop and ask ourselves, how have the universities come to be known by athletic programs? The giant stadiums built on the college campuses, again, they're not for the football players, they're not for the basketball players, not for the baseball players or soccer players, they're for the fans. These are spectator events, and these arenas and stadiums are built to hold as many spectators as possible. And again, these things are state-funded. And so whether we're talking about professional sports or moving down to collegiate and scholastic sports, or even Olympic sports, we find a strange connection between governments and entertainment venues. And we have to ask, what is the interest of government institutions in these entertainment venues? Why are they such a priority? My wife and I have driven across country a number of times because of kids being in the military and having to go to different military bases for graduations and other activities. And one of the things that's most noticeable is when you drive through a city, whether you drive through St. Louis or Nashville, as you drive through the major city, what's most noticeable, there may be some large skyscraper type of buildings, but what's most noticeable when you drive through the great cities are the sports arenas. These coliseums identify the cities. And again, we have to ask, why are our governments so interested in all of these entertainment venues? Why are they a priority in every city, just as the Colosseum was in ancient Rome? And the reason is because governments today are trying to accomplish the same thing that governments then, or the government then, was trying to accomplish with the Colosseum. These massive entertainment venues provide an endless supply of dazzling spectacle that distracts the population. There's a story in St. Augustine's Confessions where one of the young men that he was friends with, in the midst of his conversion, he and a few of his friends were going through this conversion at the same time, one after the other. And one of his friends, I think his name might have been Alypius, he went into I don't know if it was the Colosseum, but it was an arena, one of these arenas. Pretty sure it was the Colosseum. And Augustine tells the story of how, when he saw the events, going from a sober life of philosophical study and Christian discipleship, going into the Colosseum and seeing the spectacle that was on display, he lost control of himself and was just consumed by what he saw. And this is the effect, the known effect of these events, these public events, which are scheduled and organized in these massive arenas at government expense. As I said before, they are dazzling, dizzying spectacles. And it's the constant endeavor of those working these venues to come up with the most overwhelming experience possible. I can still remember when I was a kid, I went with my father and some friends to a New Jersey Devils hockey game. And I remember that sitting in there as a kid, and I wasn't even a Christian at the time I attended, but sitting in that arena, I remember thinking to myself, this is like hell. It was so wild, it was so loud, the fans were so aggressive and nasty. And it looks big on television, but when you're there, it feels like you're all crammed into a suitcase. And it's just an overwhelming experience. There's lights and cameras and dancers and cheerleaders and the players on the ice, and it's just an overwhelming spectacle. And then we add to that spectacle all of the other events that are going on. They're just constant contests and games and prizes and announcements of food and drink and all kinds of music blasting. It's a completely overstimulating experience designed to just indulge every desire of the flesh. And then you add to that one of the biggest sources of revenue at these events, which is the sale of alcohol. Just millions and millions of dollars of alcohol sales, all kinds of overpriced foods, but nobody cares, because this is the purpose of these events. It's just total indulgence. And again, these events, these arenas and stadiums, they are built with government funding. And the purpose of these spectacles is to keep the populace occupied with nonsense. Keep the populace occupied with nonsense while the smart people in society, the people who actually run things, are free to make changes to the laws, to the regulations that bring them personal benefits, while the populace in this so-called democratic society are occupied at the concert, or the football game, or the basketball game. The more corrupt the government becomes, the more money is pumped into these spectator sports and concerts and so on. And whereas it might have been one thing to go to the Colosseum back in ancient Rome, and I doubt that everybody could go frequently, in our generation here, we not only have the Colosseums, but we have them pumped into our living rooms. Endless sports and music and news and games and shows, endless, endless, endless. ESPN, everyday sports network, right in the middle of the living room. No one in the history of the world ever had ESPN. No one ever had the Colosseum in their living room, or in their bedroom, or in every room. No one ever had the Colosseum on the radio, in the car, on the smartphone, in your pocket. You can even get the ESPN app and have the notifications go off anytime there's an event related to your favorite teams. American society takes the effect of the Roman Colosseum and multiplies it by infinity. And if you're not interested in sports, that's okay, because there's a million other events and activities. Now, in the ancient Roman world, this was done intentionally as a means of controlling the people. And there's a principle of government that was involved in this. The people who are in power really have no power at all. You have a couple of men, a small number of men, who control whole cities, though those cities are filled with tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people. And yet, the policies, the laws, the activities and projects are controlled by a small number of men who direct them to their own personal benefit. And yet there are these masses of people who allow this to happen. And if at any moment they got angry, they could flip a city upside down. And so what cunning politicians have learned through the centuries is that the best way to control people is not to rule over them with an iron fist, because that just exasperates them and provokes them to riot, but to actually give them the things that they want. Let them enjoy the pleasures that they desire. This was started well before Roman civilization. This was started by the ancient Persians, who used the same policy. They would conquer a nation, allow the nation of people to go about their own activities, enjoy their own culture, not disturb them very much, and simply demand a tribute or tax from them. And as long as they paid their taxes, they would leave them alone. The Romans took it a step further during the empire, when the empire fell into corruption. And they referred to this policy of government, this method of controlling the masses. They referred to it as bread and circuses. Bread and circuses. And the leaders knew that as long as they threw some bread into the streets and sponsored some circuses in the Colosseum, the people would be satisfied, like a beekeeper filling the hive with smoke and calming the anger of the bees being disturbed. The politicians simply have to throw some bread out to the people and put on a spectacle, and they'll be happy because, as Aristotle explains in the Ethics, the end of their life is simply pleasure. And so rather than admonishing the people and educating them and calling them to virtue, corrupt politicians take advantage of the weakness of the common people and actually fund and sponsor the indulgence of those desires. And this is the culture of the common people, the culture of the mob, as the old politicians used to refer to it. It's a culture of people that can concern themselves only with the indulgence of their bodily desires. And as long as they are so, all they need to be controlled. They don't need to be whipped and beaten and corralled by police officers. None of that violence is necessary. All they need is some bread and circuses to keep them entertained. They are enslaved by this desire for self-indulgence. A whole city can be controlled by a few men because the people of the city will sign themselves up for slavery so long as they can have their bread and circuses. We see this in Old Testament Israel, when Moses was sent to lead the Hebrews out from Egyptian slavery. And God performed miracles, revealed his power through the plagues in Egypt, and led the Hebrew people out of Egypt across the Red Sea, parting the Red Sea by miraculous power. As soon as the going got difficult, the Hebrew people started to complain. They were upset that they were being made to walk to the promised land through a desert because they missed the goodies of Egypt. They complained that they missed the vegetables of Egypt, and they actually argued to go back. They were willing to go back into slavery to have the comforts that they no longer had access to in the desert, though they were free. Bread and the circuses are the price that common people are willing to trade their freedom for. And the same is true today. Now, one of the confusing things about all this is that when we look, we find Christians wrapped up in this as much as anyone else. The Christians are running into the streets for the bread in the circuses, just like the unbelievers. It's impossible to distinguish the spectators at the games from the Christians. In fact, they're part of the same crowd. I've seen grown men wear NFL jerseys to Sunday Mass. I've seen priests organize Super Bowl Sunday parties in the church on a Sunday. And you look at this and you have to wonder, how did the Christians get wrapped up in the spectacle of the Colosseum? And it's clear that there's no discernment in these things. And I know that people will get upset when I say this, but professional football makes the clearest argument against the Christians, because it just happens to be scheduled on the Lord's Day every week. Personally, I don't understand how anyone, any Christian, can read the commandment to keep the Lord's Day holy and spend it at a football stadium. I don't understand it. And I'm one who played sports and has always enjoyed sports. But when I became a Christian, it became very obvious that I can't follow this on Sunday. Sunday is a holy day. It's not a day for entertainment. It's not a day for bread and circuses. And yet in modern society, that's exactly what it is. And again, I know that some will object and pretend that there's some kind of reason for it. But I'll respond to all the smart aleck responses with this. St. Paul says this. He says, if, and I emphasize if you are risen with Christ, if you are risen with Christ, set your mind on things which are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. If you are risen with Christ, set your mind on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. That's to be the mind of a Christian. In baptism, we claim to have died with Christ, and we claim to be risen to newness of life. We claim to be new creatures, born again. And St. Paul tells us that if we have, in fact, been raised with Christ, then we are to set our minds on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. So I'll make the very easy case by asking a question. Are these things the things above? Are these things the things present where Christ is seated at the right hand of God? If not, then why are Christian minds set on these things? It's a very simple argument. Not only are we not supposed to do these things on Sundays, which again is a holy day, no one is supposed to be doing any servile labor on a Sunday, and meanwhile the stadiums are filled with employees doing exactly that, being supported in it by all of the fans talking about how they're taking the day off, which is explicitly contrary to the command, which says not only shall you take the day off, but everyone else shall as well, because it's a holy day. It's a day for worship and prayer, for works of mercy, and for the promotion of Christian culture, for study, since we have a break from the servile labor we do of the week. 6 days you shall work and you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a day of rest, not a day of idleness and pleasure seeking. It's a day of rest from work for the sake of our souls. And beyond the fact that it's on Sunday, our minds are not even supposed to be on these things. But our minds, as people who claim to be risen again through baptism, our minds are supposed to be on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. And yet, here we are, running into the street when the government tosses the bread for the common people, running for our seats when a new spectacle is put on in the Colosseum. It's pretty crazy when you think about how far Christian culture has fallen, where now suddenly the Christians are the friends of the people running the Colosseum. Very bizarre. And when we consider that the Christians do not have their minds set on things above, but that they're wrapped up in all the worldly spectacles themselves, it's no surprise that we find attempts to identify as Christians equated with political fights and quarrels and party politics, because that's what the common people do. The common people are stirred up by the news media to just constantly fight amongst themselves about nonsense. Again, while the corrupt people actually running the state do whatever they want, unchecked by an ignorant rabble, the mob, as I mentioned before. Christians think that in their political controversies and fighting, they're being quote-unquote responsible citizens. But the truth is, they're just grappling in the mud of the streets with the other peasants, fighting over the bread and circuses. Who gets to control what's on the television? Who gets to control whether the local sports team honors some gay organization? Who gets to determine whether men are allowed to participate in the women's sports? These are all the concerns of the people in the Colosseum. These are not the concerns of the people actually running the state. These are the bread and the circuses. These are the controversies among the spectators, wrapped up in the games, frustrated that they're not getting as much bread as their neighbors, trying to control the government so that they can control what goes on in the Colosseum. Just look at the topics of their controversies. They're not serious controversies. They're complaining that the Los Angeles Dodgers brought in some group of transgender wackos, so all the Catholics protest Dodger baseball. Who cares about Dodger baseball games? How have Christians even become concerned with these things? It's because they're just lost. They're lost amidst the mob, fighting against their neighbors over who gets to control the distribution of the bread and the scheduling of the circuses. And this is modern Christian culture. It's amazing to watch it. Our minds are supposed to be set on things above. We're not even supposed to be wrapped up in politics, because it really is not significant in the Christian life. And I know people will start talking about abortion and the pro-life movement. That's another subject. The truth, though, is most of these fights are about the events of the Colosseum. What's on television? What's on the radio? What's on the internet? If you look at all of these perverts on social media, their number one support comes from Christians constantly sharing, reposting, and drawing attention to what they do. The Christians, imagining themselves to be opponents of these evil things, are actually their greatest supporters, because on social media, in the digital age, attention is money. The Christians, by all of their gossip and sharing and criticizing these posts and things, they are actually funding and enriching the people that they imagine themselves to be opposing. There's just no shrewdness, no understanding among them, because they think and act like the common people, like the rabble, for whom the bread and circuses are prepared. All of these things, talking about LGBTQ, talking about transgenderism, this is all bread and circuses. Literally, circuses. While real issues like justice, education, evangelization, and so on, go untouched by the Christian community. And so, what I'd like to encourage Christians to do is consider which of these two scenarios describes their life. Are you wrestling and fighting with your fellow common people in the streets over who gets to control the bread and circuses? Or are you, having been risen with Christ, focused on things which are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God?